Thanks so much, Lynn. Good afternoon to everyone here and to everyone online. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction. It's interesting. Many years ago, but not that long ago for Lynn and me, I was a reporter and then assistant at the House of Assembly in St. John's, Newfoundland. She was the Minister of Education. So she was a very prominent Newfoundlander, and I was sort of a plebe sitting up in the stands watching her perform, and she was a very good minister. Her leadership here has been a contributing factor to ensuring the Atwater Library has maintained its prominent role in our community. So thanks for that, Lynn. Indeed, indeed, one of the factors in the preeminence of the Anglophone community has been its love for education and literacy. The great debates of Confederation in the 1860s focused on the need for a strong system of public education, and our Constitution recognized the need to protect education along linguistic and religious lines. Alexander Galt, one of the great fathers of Confederation, drafted Section 93.3 of the Vienna Act, which ensured education for Protestants in Quebec and Catholics elsewhere. He worked closely with James Williams, who was the Bishop of Quebec, who was as fervent about education as he was about religion. As the vice principal of Bishop's University, Williams wrote, "Education for survival was the achievement of mental culture, that which enables a person to reason rather than argue, and which could be accomplished only by bringing our minds in contact with genius." It was said he promoted education in all its manifestations, formal and informal, public and private, male and female, religious and secular. When you look at the literary landscape of Quebec, you can see the enormous contributions of so many authors, poets, journalists, historians. Hugh MacLennan, who offered the description of our society, Two Solitudes. Some wonderful literature in that book, which I've read a couple of times. But we forget the expression Two Solitudes came from a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. The poem was, "Love consists of this, two solitudes that meet, protect, and greet each other." Then there's Frank Scott, the brilliant constitutionalist, who wrote poems that satirized politicians and evoked our land. And of course, Leonard Cohen, who once revealed his song Suzanne wasn't about a woman, it was actually about Montreal. And there are so many other great English Quebec writers, Irving Layton, Mavis Gallant, David Fenario, Louise Penny, Neil Basundath, and I could list so many more. As someone who's published a couple of books, I'm always in awe of their artistry. But literacy is not a gift. It is the result of education and a culture of respect, even love for knowledge and language. And that's what was instilled by the people who came here. Indeed, one of the reasons Montreal grew to the metropolis of Canada was its educational institutions, and notably its public school system, its English public school system. We read of so many great men and women who came here with nothing and through education thrived. How many brilliant writers, doctors, scientists came out of our public schools? Their legacy was institutions who served and employed others, and a country where upward mobility is now taken as a given. Where in a generation, one can go from selling melons in a grocery store to pleading in a courtroom, and in another generation to negotiating trade deals in Washington, D.C. That's my wife's story. Her father, Manny Feldman, worked at the family grocery store, the Feldman Market on the Main, before getting a law degree and becoming a Montreal city councillor. His daughter, Elaine, became a senior diplomat, was our lead negotiator on NAFTA and the president of the Environmental Assessment Agency, all from a family in two generations that had immigrated to the Main. This is a story that's told time and time again, and probably resonates in this room and online as well. Our community has contributed widely to national and international commerce, organizations, and diplomacy. And it was education that brought forth that greatness. Now, I'm speaking today from an international perspective as someone who's worked outside of Canada and came back to Quebec. But let me just digress for a few moments to say how my family and I got here. It goes back to 1640 and the arrival of the Gagnons in Quebec, and even farther back with my indigenous ancestors. Their descendant was my maternal great-great-grandmother, Marie Sylvain, who married John the Measurer, an Anglophone Protestant from Gaspé. He was a clerk in a store in Quebec City, 24 years old. She was 36, a Catholic and French Canadian. 20 years later, he owned that store and others, a factory and a few ships, and he was elected mayor of Quebec City. They said he was un homme du peuple, a man of the people. And when trouble broke out on the Quebec City docks, he refused to read the Riot Act and instead told jokes and went among the crowd and convinced everyone just to go home. He was a great man and apparently quite a bon vivant as well. He was fluently bilingual, as were all my Quebec City ancestors, and I now live in the home that his son and daughter-in-law, William, John, and Emily, purchased in Kamouraska in 1884. My father's father was an immigrant from Ireland, and he came to build the Grand Trunk Railway. He married my grandmother, a British orphan, who was living in Trois-Rivières. So I'm the descendant of Québécois de souche and immigrants. I grew up in NDG in Montreal West with a few weeks each summer in Kamouraska. French was a huge struggle for me, and I barely scraped through at graduation in 1969. That summer, I met Réjeanne Richard, a beautiful young chanteuse from Kamouraska. It was the first love for both of us. She knew 5 words in English. Oh, Andrew, you're so stupid. I scraped up every word of French I'd ever learned from elementary school, and it was a memorable summer, the last of my childhood, and there were many profound lessons learned. With that inspiration and a great deal of effort, I went to Cégep and university, learned French, became a reporter, covered Parliament Hill and the Montreal Canadiens Stanley Cup wins in the 1970s as a student, and then professionally, I was a reporter in Montreal, Quebec City, Calgary, Montreal again with CJD, and then St. John's. I knew and interviewed René Lévesque and all his cabinet, including Camille Lorrain. I advised politicians in Quebec, Newfoundland, and Ottawa. I was elected in Montreal West, and in that position as council, I made the national news frequently. I then traveled abroad and lived and worked in Switzerland, Macedonia, Bangladesh, and Côte d'Ivoire, and then later in India. I have held a jar with Ebola in it, slept under malaria nets in Bangladeshi villages, biked the hot streets of Delhi, worked in refugee camps, represented Canada at the United Nations, wrote speeches for ministers and prime ministers and governors general, and met with senior officials of many governments. Everywhere I've gone, I was welcomed as a Canadian. And certainly my ability to speak French was an asset in Geneva, France, and Côte d'Ivoire. My kids went to public school in Geneva in French and continued in Ottawa until graduation. So we all speak French fluently. There are 350 million francophones in the world, and believe it or not, half of them speak French as a second language. So that includes me, you, people online, and your neighbors. The reason I tell you this is that I very often encounter people, especially francophones, who are surprised to meet Anglophones who speak French. They'll sometimes say, "Where are you from? What's your accent?" I say, "Je suis un Anglo-Québécois." Ah, okay. This is one of the findings of a recent report from the Official Languages Commissioner. It also revealed that people of both language groups get along in Quebec on a personal level. Well, newsflash, we always have. From the time my great-great-grandfather was elected mayor of Quebec City, English and French Canadians have fallen in love, worked together, collaborated in politics, and fought together in war. We don't hear enough of those stories of our past, of what we all share. Instead, we hear how we were the villains of Quebec history. But it was nationalists exploiting language paranoia and public servants drafting and implementing extreme laws who caused divisions in our society. When René Lévesque said to Eric Maldoff, "Hey, Maldoff, let's grab a smoked meat at Ben's," you know, they got along pretty well. So I am a Francophile. I admit, I love the French language, and I appreciate Quebec culture. I know all the words to every Beau Dommage song, which probably dates me. I read French newspapers on a regular basis. and I watch Quebecois movies and television. I'm currently a town councillor in Kamouraska, where no one speaks English, and I received the largest majority on the council in 2021. Not bad for a kid who couldn't string a few sentences in French together when he was trying to impress une belle Québécoise at 17. So I live, work, and play in French. I've always been an advocate for Francophone minorities in Alberta, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Ontario. After nearly winning a seat in the Ontario legislature in 1985, I went to Queen's Park, the center of government in Toronto, and was directly involved with the drafting and promotion of the French Language Services Bill, Bill 8. Who was instrumental in assisting us in doing that? Well, none other than Anglos from Alliance Quebec, who are working in solidarity with Francophone minorities across the country. When we announced the legislation at a conference of Franco-Ontarians in Ottawa, people stood and cheered with tears in their eyes. In my work internationally, I met many people who wanted to know about the political situation in Quebec. A Swiss border guard stopped me on the eve of the 1995 referendum to say he hoped Canada would stay together, as it was an example to his own country with its 4 official languages. A UNICEF colleague in Northern Macedonia asked me why I wasn't a separatist. You may know Macedonia was a state of the former Yugoslavia, which then became independent. I asked him how many Macedonians had been senior ministers, president of Yugoslavia, prime minister, head of the army. The answer was none. I noted in Canada, we've had several prime ministers, governors generals, heads of the military, and key ministers from Quebec. And he said, I don't understand what the problem is. I worked for what's now Global Affairs Canada for 15 years and for the public service for 20 years altogether. In September 2017, an article in La Presse appeared saying, Est-ce que le temps est mûr pour le retour des anglophones? Is it time for Anglophones to come back? I had just retired and planned to move back to Quebec, and I was quoted in the article fairly extensively. And 3 years later, I moved from Ottawa to Kamouraska. So I don't have to be fighting this fight. I could just as well leave it to others. I could live in a completely unilingual Quebec with no problems, because that's effectively my life right now. But I do not want to live in a society that is composed of one language, one culture, or one belief. That is governed by the intolerant. We live in a world of incredible diversity and complexity. It is at our fingertips and all around us. It is a world of constant change. We English Quebecers have embraced that within our own community, our province, and within our hearts. We seek a society of greater tolerance and understanding, because intolerance is unacceptable in 2024. Most of the wars of the 20th century, the First, the Second, Korean, and elsewhere, were linked to nationalism, what Albert Einstein called an infantile disease. It is the measles of mankind. The 19th century notion of the nation state is of a country whose ethnicity and territory are the same. Think of France, Italy, Germany, Spain. This is what Quebec nationalists believe: one language for one territory. It is that if that parochial mindset were to win the day, Canada would crumble and eventually cease to exist. Canada is a 20th century country open to the world. Canada, with all its flaws, from its very beginnings, has had a history of accommodating people of other races, religions, and of course, languages. We mean it when we say that there is strength in diversity. And in survey after survey abroad, Canada is seen as one of the best places in the world to live. I think it's because of our foundation in duality, going all the way back to the Quebec Act of 1774. There was a time when Quebec shared that notion of diversity, when the talk was of civic nationalism. When I was a journalist in Quebec City, I asked René Lévesque, who's a Québécois? His response was, someone who pays taxes in Quebec. Remember that he had witnessed the liberation of Dachau as a journalist, and he understood the threat of ethnocentric nationalism. By comparison, we have Premier Legault, who says his first priority is the French language, and he's going to build a museum of French Quebec history. Looking back in history, heads of state and government established at the Peace of Westphalia one of the first international agreements ever in 1648, that the priority of any state was the security of its citizens. This principle of sovereignty has endured over centuries and is a foundational principle of the United Nations. So according to international convention, the first priority of any head of government has to be the physical health and economic security of its citizens. An overemphasis on a single issue like language over health, security, university education, government services, and the economy is an abdication of that responsibility. And when a portion of that population is openly discriminated against, that's an abject failure to take seriously the principles enunciated at Westphalia, at Confederation, in our Charters of Rights, and in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted by a Montrealer, John Peters Humphrey. The Universal Declaration in Article 1 states, all human rights are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's followed by Article 2. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the Declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Now, you may recall, we're going to get into history of it here, that the UN played a role in the language wars of the 1990s. The Ballantyne case involved 3 merchants in Sutton and Huntingdon who challenged Bill 178 at the UN Human Rights Committee in 1989. It was supported as a violation of the International Covenant on Human Rights in 1993. There were 3 parts to the case: freedom of expression, discrimination against the community, and minority rights. They won on freedom of expression, but lost on discrimination and minority rights. The embarrassment of being criticized by the UN on freedom of expression caused the Barassa government to not reintroduce the notwithstanding clause and to present Bill 86, which allowed for English on signage. On minority rights, this is very interesting, there was a split decision with the result based on the notion English-speaking Canadians in Quebec are not a minority in Canada, which is the member of the UN. The minority in Canada is French Canadians. However, 5 members of the body dissented, saying this should not be a criteria for discrimination. And in the succeeding years, and I know this because I was a UN officer working in the UN Division of Foreign Affairs, that there has been a broader application to the definition of minorities. Sadly, the Bloc Québécois and even some liberals did not do their due diligence. When Bill C-13 was in committee last year, this is the new Official Languages Act, the Bloc invoked the Ballantyne case dozens of times to insist that Anglophones are not a minority and therefore should not be recognized as such. This was the rationale for rejecting the concept of symmetry of minority language groups, which had been the hallmark of official language policy since 1969. Now, all of this is based on arguments that are out of date. When I was at Foreign Affairs, I dealt with issues of minority rights within subnational states, and since 1993, we have seen discrimination turn to violence against minorities in Rwanda, Burundi, the former Republic of Yugoslavia, Indonesia, East Timor, and Fiji. The Montagnards in Vietnam and the Roma in Eastern Europe have also been targeted. The UN itself says it is tragedies like these that compel the international community to encourage a dialogue between minorities and governments within all societies. That means all minorities. And I send that message to the Bloc Québécois, to the Conservative Party, and of course to Premier François Legault. Most recently, we saw the Legault government back down on directives on health. And while it was a small victory, our rights to health services in English should never have been at risk. It was thanks to warriors like Eric Maldoff and the Gazette's Aaron Durfel, who fought tirelessly to expose the maliciousness of those directives. But there remain more challenges in our healthcare system. Hospitals once defined as capable of serving in English, French, and another language are now being restricted to French and the other language. Regulations affecting the workplace could still mean that doctors and nurses could be victims of anonymous complaints if they don't speak French to patients. And hospitals would be constrained in hiring with stringent rules requiring fluency in French above all other skills. So we're not out of the woods. There are still barriers to healthcare for English speakers in Quebec, and there are more, perhaps even more difficult fights to come. The Premier calls us the best treated minority in the world. He should travel more. Because I can name better treated minorities right off the top of my head. The Swiss Romand, the Francophones in Switzerland, among whom I can count dozens of friends. Belgian Walloons, Christians in India, Albanians in Macedonia, whom I worked with in the refugee camps in Macedonia, the Swedes in Finland, and the Okinawans in Japan. And it's a truism that you don't improve the lot of one group by suppressing another. Everywhere I've traveled, I've learned other languages, and many of my international colleagues spoke 4 or 5 languages fluently. Not one of them ever said to me that learning another language made them less fluent in their mother tongue. Not one Swede, Finn, German, ou même un Français ou une Française told me speaking English made them less who they were. And yet that is what Quebec nationalists would want you to believe. And they refuse to recognize that English is the language of business and the world. And well, I wouldn't want to return to the days when you had to speak English to get ahead in Quebec, to be a foreman or to be an executive. There's a huge value in being bilingual. The 80% of Quebec Anglos who speak French are proof of that. All that said, there are unilingual Anglophones in Quebec. And who are they? Well, they're the elderly, they're Indigenous, visible minorities, rural poor, recent immigrants from English-speaking countries, and physically or mentally challenged people. These are people who need government services more than anyone, who are on the margins of society, and it's not right to deny them those services as taxpayers and citizens. And then there are the so-called non-historic Anglos. Over 500,000 people arbitrarily denied their right as citizens and taxpayers. And it's an absurd description of who English Quebecers are. For example, my father, Philip Caddell, was born in Brantford, but he lived in Scotland for 7 years after he was born in Canada. He was a graduate of Lachine High when he came back to Canada. He was an officer in combat in Sicily and Italy, a volunteer and leader in dozens of organizations in Montreal. But he would not be an historic Anglophone were he alive because of his education in Scotland. My late son, James, was born in Montreal, grew up near Ormstown in the Chateauguay Valley, moved to the US at 10, came back to attend Dawson, McGill, and RMC, and serve in the military for more than a dozen years. He was a UN peacekeeper in Bosnia. He was not an historic Anglophone. Gemma Rayburn-Baines is a prominent Quebecer who has made enormous contributions to the Black community. She came here at the age of 14. She's not an historic Anglophone and could be denied services in English. I belong to the Wednesday night discussion group founded in 1982 by David and Diana Nicholson. At the most recent meeting, we did a poll. More than half of the people there were not historic Anglos. These are people who've made huge contributions to academia, business, medicine, science in Quebec. There are 500,000 Quebecers like them, Canadian citizens from the Caribbean, Asia, Africa, England, Ireland, who speak English and don't qualify as Anglophones for the Quebec government. How ridiculous, how cruel, how unfair is that? And yet, that is one of the key sections of Bill 96. That's why I helped found the Task Force on Linguistic Policy. 3 years ago, in June of 2021, we were shocked by 2 egregious pieces of legislation, Bill 96 and Bill C-32, the changes to the Official Languages Act. This later became Bill C-13. We looked at the political landscape and saw the need for a grassroots-based advocacy group for all English-speaking Quebecers that would reach out across the province. Since the closing of Alliance Quebec, nothing like that existed. The English Secretariat in Quebec City, which was established by Philippe Couillard, had been weaponized by François Legault with grants tied to silence them, for grants to community groups tied to silence them. And the QCGN, while becoming more activist, was still a federally funded coordinating body for organizations. Colin Standish reached out to me and others to form a working group that would analyze these bills and provide moderate, incisive analysis. We worked diligently applied to become a nonprofit organization. We brought in people from across Quebec. We consulted widely, and we were the first to warn of the dangers in Bill 96. In an op-ed published in the Gazette in August of 2021, we wrote, "These pieces of legislation threaten the existence of our community, institutions, and jobs. C-32 would apply Bill 101's regulations on federally chartered companies, and Bill 96, shielded in the Canadian Constitution's notwithstanding clause, threatens the rights and freedoms of all Quebecers. It contains draconian sections allowing unlimited search and seizure of information, limits enrollment and growth in English cégeps, and place the onus on municipal councils to fight to retain their bilingual status. The CAQ's intent to recognize Quebec as a French-speaking nation stands to have a disastrous impact on the Constitution's protection of English." August of 2021. So I became involved with the task force to fight wrongs and to right wrongs and to fight intolerance. And since 2021, we've undertaken dozens of interviews in the media and put in op-eds in both the French and English media, launched a Taking It to Court initiative with the Bergman Law Firm to mount 2 lawsuits against Bill 96, presented briefs to the QCGN hearings on Bill 96, produced an advertisement to counter the propaganda of the nationalist group L'Impératif Français, mobilized hundreds of participants for anti-Bill 96 rallies, and submitted a brief to the Senate and official language committees, House official language committees. We also have initiated a Tell Us Your Story campaign to expose the abuses of Bill 96. So if you have any stories, please check our website. And we've collaborated with other advocacy organizations like the QCGN to complement and further their work. Our website is www.thetaskforce.ca. If you're interested, you can sign up and become a member and follow us. We need people, and we need more and more. We've got thousands of people online, and we have hundreds of members, but we'd like more. The website provides our mission and vision statement, which sets out our principles and beliefs. And our board is composed of prominent members of our community from across Quebec. As a grassroots nonprofit organization, we're not supported by government funds. This gives us greater latitude to say and do as we like. When we speak forcefully, and we're not afraid to criticize any government or call them to account. We believe the best way of creating a better society is through dialogue, sharing, and protection of the rights of all. It's not through the imposition of discriminatory laws that reduce access to healthcare, diminish rights, or create barriers between people. It's why I'm the lead plaintiff in the 2 cases challenging Bill 96 in court. While there are several cases challenging the law, ours is unique in that it involves individuals detrimentally affected by the law. We have a woman from Central America who's more comfortable in English, but she has ulcerative colitis and she can't get information in English. A mother whose son is autistic and can't get services in English. The son can't. A teacher concerned about the restrictions in education. A high-tech business person originally from Ireland who is afraid of expanding to more than 25 employees because as an Irish immigrant, he can't function in French. We're also challenging Quebec's attempt to change the Constitution to recognize Quebec as a nation. We have been forced to defend the Constitution, and as such, we have been served. We've served both the Attorneys General of Quebec and Canada. Ironically, our case has been slowed down by the demand for a hearing in January by the Attorney General of Canada, who refuses to acknowledge his duty to defend the Constitution. Our second case is an injunction against any further expansion of Bill 96. It's an uphill battle, but we refuse to back down. All of these legal cases cost money, and we've raised over $150,000 for our cases, much of it in small donations from people like you and you online. So we need your help. English-speaking Quebecers compose the largest bilingual community in Canada, and English is an asset. You'd have to be willfully blind not to recognize English is the international language of business, of diplomacy, and travel. English-speaking Quebecers are an asset to Quebec, not a threat. We choose to live here, work here, and raise our families here, but we will never accept to be discriminated against for who we are. We want to progress into a future in Quebec in a spirit of respect, acceptance, collaboration, and love. So for me, it's not an issue of language. It's a matter of human rights on an international basis, looking at Quebec from a much broader spectrum. English-speaking Quebecers are full citizens who pay taxes, who built great institutions, and 1.5 million strong, we pay to maintain them. Every single person who speaks English is part of this historic community. This is home, chez nous. And despite the narrow parochialism of Quebec nationalism, Quebec is one of the best places in the world to live. Our metropolis, Montreal, is one of the most multilingual cities in the world. We have safe neighborhoods where people can make a living. And we have always seen ourselves as Montrealers, part of a dynamic community, one known throughout the world. And I can tell you, when I say I'm a Canadian from Montreal, wherever I've been, people know where Montreal is. And the rest of Quebec is spectacular and welcoming. I love my town of Kamouraska for its peace, tranquility, francophone culture, and small town feel. And I love Montreal too for its energy, entrepreneurialism, multilingualism, and its big city pace. But I would never want Kamouraska to be another Montreal, and as such, I would never accept that Montreal could be turned into a village, a unilingual francophone village, like Kamouraska. At the task force, that's what we believe, and we have to get our message across. So here's a few points for you to remember, to tell your friends, your family, and your neighbors. We are one of the most diverse communities in the world, with dozens of nationalities, faiths, backgrounds, and mother tongues, who use English as our common language. We are not a threat to Quebec. We are an enormous asset as we interpret Quebec to Canada and to the world. We are not rich. The median income of Francophone Quebecers exceeds that of Anglophone Quebecers, and there are more Anglophone Quebecers below the poverty line than Francophones as a percentage. French is not in decline in Quebec. Studies have shown it's growing, with the addition of people of other mother tongues, like you and me, who speak French. Our institutions are Quebec institutions. Our universities, our hospitals, and our community institutions are Quebec institutions open to all Quebecers. Whenever I speak to young people, I tell them they should stay and get involved in Quebec and Canada. We need them to join political parties, to make their voices heard, to run for office. There'll be municipal elections next year across Quebec. The next generation of Quebec's leaders will come from our villages, towns, and cities. We need to encourage young Anglophones and Allophones to put their names forward. Now, I get a great deal of pleasure of being an elected official, and the last few years have been very good to me. But it angers me that over and over again we have to fight the narrow-minded, parochial, disingenuous, and even bigoted politicians in Quebec City who don't represent the majority of Quebecers. Because this is home, and it always has been. With my family with roots back to 1640, and my mother's side and my father's who came here from Ireland and Scotland. I will never stop fighting for a better life for all minority languages in this country, for a better Quebec and a better Canada, because that is my inherent right as a Quebecer, a Canadian, and a citizen of the world. My life, and many others, has been dedicated to serving my country, to promoting understanding and engaging in dialogue. In short, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Perhaps not in the same way that my father and my son courageously offered themselves abroad, but I can tell you, traveling abroad with a maple leaf pin or sitting behind a desk that says Canada on it is an unforgettable experience. Our battle here is one of David fighting Goliath, but remember how that turned out. I've never backed down from a fight, and I know our members and our community won't either. So when we're victorious, we'll celebrate. With every small victory, with every change in perception, public opinion, and policy, we'll share the joy and satisfaction of each triumph. And mark my words, those victories will come. For our time is now, our cause is just, and our spirit will never be broken. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you for your advocacy, your powerful advocacy. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to come to Tom first with the mic. Questioners have to use the mic for the Zoom audience to hear.
Yeah, hi. You talk about how at the grassroots level, Anglos and Francos get along very well. So how do you account for the disconnect at the political level where the majority of Francophone voters vote for the CAQ, which is with its punitive policies, and now moving toward the PQ, which will be no less friendly toward us?
That's a really, really good question. I would say that people sometimes vote for certain reasons, and they don't necessarily think about their personal relationships when they do that. The other thing, of course, is that outside of Montreal, there's about 5 million people. Of those 5 million, there's about 200,000 people who speak English. So, you know, it's not unusual for me to be asked when I speak to someone in La Pocatière or Montmagny or Kamouraska, or not in Kamouraska, because they all know me. but you know, like, where are you from? What country are you from? So I think we have to, there is a serious problem in that there's kind of a ceiling. It's not even a glass ceiling, it's like a steel ceiling that prevents us from breaking through to the French media. And much of that is because Pierre Pellado owns the most important media in the province, TVA and the Journal de Montréal and Journal de Quebec. And so we don't get our message out enough. And my God, I would love to be on Tout le monde en parle, and I would say the same thing in French as I say in English. And I think that maybe it would wake a lot of people up. I mean, Jack Layton went on Tout le monde en parle and won the election on the basis of one appearance because 3 million people saw him and thought, I can vote for that guy. And I think you can change people's minds. I think my French is good enough that I can debate with other people. So I've offered to debate any nationalist, anywhere, anytime. And I think we have to get out and do those things. So that's a role that we have to play. And I think whatever happens in terms of the way that people vote, it will make the political parties that much more aware of the need to be able to compromise. I mean, the first PQ governments, as I say, Eric Maldoff went out with Quebec and they thrashed policy out at Bent. And the reason for that was that they got along and they respected each other. So I think we need more of that.
I saw another hand up. I'm bringing you the mic.
Just a question about being able to use the notwithstanding clause as a trump to overcome court rulings in Canada and any sort of decency in the Charter of Rights. Is there any plan to go to the UN, since that seems to be the only way that the government in Quebec can be publicly shamed into treating English people perhaps fairly?
Well, the arrangement with the UN is that you have to have gone as far as you can within your country before you can take the resort of going to the UN. So what happened with Bill 178 was it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The decision was made. It was favorable. The notwithstanding clause was imposed. And so because of that, the group went to, that of the merchants from Huntington and Sutton, went to the UN and they got a decision that was favorable. And within the 5 years, it occurred within the 5 years. And that's why Bourassa did not resort to implementing the notwithstanding clause again for the next 5 years on Bill 178. So it would have to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and then we would be able to go to the United Nations. Now, the United Nations doesn't really decide anything per se, but because it's an international forum, the government of Quebec would be embarrassed by the result, and I'm sure that the result would be, well, I'm hoping that the Supreme Court's going to judge favorably in our case, but because there's so many parts of Bill 96 that are overtly unconstitutional. I would hope we don't have to go to the UN, but if we did, we have to accept that it's only really has an effect on public opinion and the embarrassment of the government if it were to come through. So.
Other questions? The Zoom attendees are welcome to type questions and comments in the chat. What's the time frame for the court case?
Well, because we've been derailed by the federal government, we're going to court on the 29th of June to deal with this crazy submission, which says that because Bill 96 is a provincial law, that it doesn't have anything to do with the feds. But first of all, you've got the constitutional change, which definitely affects the Constitution of Canada, and it's part of Bill 96. And the second thing is, although this isn't part of our court case, the federal government has integrated the Charter of the French language into the Official Languages Act. And so therefore, they've taken provincial law and they've incorporated it into a federal law. I mean, it's a case where they're refusing to recognize that that they've actually incorporated provincial law into federal law, and they're saying, well, this is only a provincial law. Well, no, you've actually already blotted your copybook or whatever by having this provincial law involved. So you're in the thick of it, plus you're refusing to defend the Constitution of Canada, and therefore we're taking you to court because we are having to do that instead of you.
I'm coming to you with the mic.
I want to know why all the groups here in Quebec don't get together and fight as one unit, because there's so many different groups here. The Quebec Networking, there was a group in Verdun, there's many groups, and you're not all together, you're all going separately, and they seem to fall apart or disappear.
That's a very, very good point, and I've said many times, and I'll say it again today, that if there's a flaw in our community, is that we tend to eat our own. And the one thing that I promised when I became the head of this organization was that I would never, ever put down or criticize another organization for the work that they were doing. And I've been pretty faithful to that. We've tried to sort of wean out some of the people that are on the margins, if you like, on this issue, but we are very much a moderate group that is a big tent that brings people in and encourages that. Now, that said, we are one organization, and there are many, and I think there is a need for a forum that would bring together all those organizations and allow people to coalesce around ideas and share best practices, because that's one thing that we don't have. Now, the EMSB went out of its way to bring people together about a year and a half ago, and there was a very good meeting where all of those organizations and many of the litigants in the lawsuits were present. We haven't done anything since then, and I think there's a need to have a formal organization that would be led by someone very prominent, and that would be a fairly informal organization, but would at least bring us all into the same room and allow us to communicate with each other.
Peter.
Two questions. First of all, 2 nights ago on the news, I heard Julius Gray speaking and about a court case. And my first question is how does that relate or not relate to what you're doing? And the second question concerns Indigenous people. How do the Indigenous people fit into all of this, or the Indigenous communities? What role do they play in this?
So Julius Gray is representing 24 municipalities, I think it is, across Quebec, from southern Quebec all the way up to the lower North Shore, and back up towards Pontiac. There is and they're municipalities. And there's another case involving Town Mount Royal and Hampstead, and a few other municipalities, similar thing. about their ability to communicate between themselves, between school boards and municipalities, between municipalities in English, okay? Because they would have, and they'd have to speak like the mayor of Côte Saint Luc was saying, we'd have to send a French notice to the Côte Saint Luc dancing group, because this is what the law says, and they want to be able to operate in English if they need to. So that's one thing. There are 13 lawsuits, I believe. 13. Dale Weber is here. She's our Secretary Treasurer and Major Domo. So there's sub, yeah. So those there's the EMSB lawsuit. There's the municipalities, the 2 municipalities. There's also an Indigenous lawsuit against Bill 96. There's ours, and each one of them is different. But the one what makes us unique is that, oh yeah, there's one by Fasken, which was actually, there was a stay of proceedings, and it deals with contracts, because contracts are only legal in French according to Bill 96, and to translate a 500-page contract for a business would be an incredible task, plus the translators aren't available, and you can just imagine how difficult that would be. So, and you're talking about international companies that would have to be doing 500-page contracts in French. So, our case is unique in that it is the only one that deals with individuals who are affected severely by the law. And we can add any number of people to the 6 people we already have. And I'm the lead plaintiff. I sort of represent every person in Quebec who's affected by the law and affected and upset by the human rights issues. But we have specific people who've been affected by the law in a detrimental way. The others are mostly institutions, municipalities, groups of people, but not individuals. So that's what makes ours different. Now, your second question was about the Indigenous people. Well, they say they have their own lawsuit. We have reached out to them. Out of the 11 First Nations in Quebec, I don't know if you know this, but there's 9 who use English as their main language. So most Indigenous people, and you saw this with Mary Simon, the Governor General, who's an Inuit from Quebec, they have English as their main second language. And this causes, Bill 96 causes them severe problems because they can't operate in French, and they're, as I say, they operate in either their own language of their First Nation or they operate in English. And so they have a problem. And so they are part of our cause.
Another question.
What happens to the municipalities that aren't included in some of those bills that you're going for?
Well, presumably, they will be brought in, and because it's kind of like the RAND formula where you negotiate on behalf of some people and everybody benefits. So if of those 24 or plus the others that are involved, well, it'd be 24 plus the other, because there's one case of 24 and then there's another, Hampstown, Mount Royal. I'm not sure if they've got any more with them. So anyway, all the other bilingual municipalities, I think there's 91, they would benefit. Yeah.
And now to the Zoom chat, and then I'll come to the man with his hand up in the room. Penny says, regarding embarrassing the government, what about something like the New York Times Canada letter?
Well, we've written op-eds for the New York Times. We've written to the Canada desk. We've talked to their journalists here. We've been in the Wall Street Journal. We've been in Maclean's magazine, as the task force has been. And we've made some strides there. But it's not easy. The New York Times just did a piece on the educational provisions in Bill 96, and not in Bill 96, but the Quebec government's decision to charge foreign students and out-of-province students more for Concordia, McGill, and Bishops. But it's hard getting space, and if anybody has any ideas or knows any contacts for us to make, I'd love to talk to them.
Another person in the Zoom audience wonders if you've done outreach to the Tout le monde en parle producers.
Yes. Yes. And they don't seem to be that interested. I try as hard as I can, and I've actually been in the same room as the Eric Girard, who's the Minister of Finance, but also the Minister for the Anglophone community, who spoke at Bishops when I was speaking to the Bishops Forum. And what was surprising was that the lack of real knowledge of the Anglophone community and of Francophone minorities outside the country, because he started talking about what the situation would be for a person who was a Francophone in Saskatoon. And the week before in Kamouraska, I'd met somebody from Saskatoon who was a Francophone, and was just going on about how great it was for all the services they had. Their kids were being educated in French, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I said in French to Girard, "That's not true." And he said, "What? What?" And clearly he didn't know what he was talking about. Then he said, "Well, what about Edmonton?" I said, "Edmonton? They've got suburbs that are Francophone, St. Paul, St. Albert." So like he sort of stopped in his tracks and said, well, move on, you know? So I think the problem is education. These people do not know what's going on in the rest of the country, and they fall back on cliches. I mean, it's just like, you know, it's there. You'd think that it was 1959 in terms of the way that some people talk about les Anglais, you know?
So last question.
Thanks. Hi. Is the task force going to get involved with the Bill 21 case that's going to the Supreme Court because it's related to the notwithstanding clause, which is related to the task force lawsuit?
We've applied to the Supreme Court to be a participant, a plaintiff at the Supreme Court as an interested party. And it's because of the effect of the notwithstanding clause. Although our case, although part of it would be affected by if the Supreme Court supported the notwithstanding clause 110%, our case is based on the idea that rights existed before 1982 and they existed after 1982, and therefore simply putting the notwithstanding clause on a law does not necessarily take away rights that already existed. But the notwithstanding clause is important, and so we've applied to participate in that case. The Supreme Court will decide whether or not we are, and if we are, obviously we've got to raise money to pay the lawyers that are going to be pleading.
Okay, well, that was really